Hello everyone, and thank you all for joining me today. Before we start, could you please drop me a plus for me in the chat so that I can see that you hear me clearly? Okay, yeah, thank you. Great. So let's start with our webinar. My name is Victoria, and today we're going to discuss how to improve lead management process. If you have any questions for me during the webinar, please drop me a line in the chat. I'll try to answer your questions at the end. For those of you that joined us today for the very first time, please allow me to say a few words about Integros. The company was founded in 2002, and since then we've worked on over 150 projects. And Integros has been Sugar CRM partner from 2008. Not only do we implement comprehensive CRM solution, but we also develop ready-to-use Sugar add-ons. And actually, Logic Builder and Timeline Viewer you'll be seeing in today's demonstration of how to integrate GoToWebinar with Sugar and how to build effective omnichannel marketing solutions. And anyone working in omnichannel environment faces number of typical challenges. First of all, it is providing seamless communications, especially with the webinar after the standard follow-ups when we send the message in one channel, but the response or reaction from the customer can come in any other channel that would be convenient for the customer. And plus, in addition to this, in order to increase the likelihood of such communication, it is critically important for us to personalize our messages using in them not only the information about lead and its company that we have, but also how did the lead responded to the content of our webinar. To do this, we need to correctly identify our webinar participants in order to obtain qualitative data about the company and its history, and as well as collect data on how the participant responded to the webinar material. With this, let's start the demonstration of the solution. Let me switch to Sugar. So what we did at first is we created a custom webinar module to keep the records of all our webinar, and we also extended a lead module with additional fields where we keep behavior data that we collect from the webinar that you'll see later. When we have a new webinar, the webinar moderator creates a new webinar record in Sugar, and once the webinar key for the GoToWebinar is filled out, this is actually the signal for the system that there is a new webinar, and system will automatically start the workflow to collect and process the data from that webinar. So this process is designed in an advanced workflow, which we use as an orchestrator for all our processes. And this process contains two parts. So the first one is a cycle of collecting and processing data from webinar registrant. So its life cycle starts when we begin the webinar registration, and it continues until the webinar is held. And we have the second part, which is actually when we process attendance data from our webinar. And this is what happens after the webinar has ended, and we need to collate data about how the attendees behaved during the webinar. Now let's look at both parts in more details. So we start with processing a new registrant from the webinar. And the main action here, you can see this one, it's a logic builder action that gets the leads from the webinar registrants. And actually what you see here, it is a simple brick that represents this logic builder action, and behind it is actually a whole flowchart of which consists a bunch of automated logic, such as like at the beginning we start with getting our registrants from GoToWebinar via API. And for those of you that think that API is complicated, let me show you that it's simple. So let's just dive into this logic builder action and see what is behind. So logic builder is another visual designer that allows us to construct different sugar logic without using code. So actually what you see here, it is the logic hidden behind the API requests that system sends to GoToWebinar to get the registrants. And after that, the business logic that follows it, that actually processes this response, meaning it can be as complicated as you want. So in our case, it's quite complicated because we want to ensure that the data we get in the system has high quality. So we don't just create leads based on our registrant from GoToWebinar, but we also process this data. So we try to automate as much of the lead identification process as we can. So if we look at some other blocks here, you can see that we get new leads from the webinar that we didn't have before. Then we have the block that based on this lead email get the domain that we can later use to check whether there is account related to this lead in the system. And here we also look if there is contact in the system, and etc. etc. So basically there is a lot of logic hidden behind this simple brick. So we get our registrants, we process the response, create lead, and then we analyze the data we have. So we check whether this lead is new contact or existing based on the email. If we have existing contact, we link the record, or if it's a new lead, we create the contact for it. Also, we check whether there is related account. So if it's existing contact, we see if that contact already has account. If so, that we can easily convert the lead. If not, we try to find the account by the domain. And so if the system is successful, then all this happening automatically, and we have a lot of leads that we can identify as our existing customers, our partners, or our former customers that register for the webinar. And Then we also need to, since we want to get the highest quality data that possible, we also look at those leads that have some information missing. So for example, we didn't find a contact or we didn't find the account, and for such cases we create an enrichment tasks to find that data in the system, not in the system, but to find that data in some open sources, like for example use hint to see if we can enrich the data. So let me go back to the webinar. If we go back to the webinar, we'll see that here under the webinar we can see all the leads that we are getting from that webinar and registrants, and if for some of those we require to enrich the data that we have in the system, we have different types of tasks. So for example, as you can see, there is one failed task to find accounts. So we see that we have existing contact in our system, but we doesn't know the company he belongs to. And we can see like the other one when we need to define the account. If we go here, we can see that it was successful. And if we look at the record, we see that it was converted and we actually found the account for this lead. So the user looked for it manually and found that this is MBM contact, and so etc. For example, if we have existing accounts but there are some information missing, like account type, that we also use in our follow-up, then we create such task for the users as well. So such approach allows us to provide users with easier way and faster way to identify and the leads from the webinar, because each of such tasks has its own description, like what specifically he needs to do with this lead, which part of information is missing, or for example when there is new account, like the steps he needs to take, like what he can use. So it's just like providing some helpful tips, and he can know exactly what he needs to do with each specific lead. Plus, since we get the leads from registration over time, they can process this task as the new registrants appear. However, as our practice shows, most of the participants register just before the webinar, so we don't forget about them. So after the webinar has so if we see that the webinar has ended, before proceeding with collecting behavior data, we still do one more round of so actually this logic builder time is the same one as we had previously. So what it does, just get the those late registrants that registered like right before the webinar that we didn't get on the previous cycle. And after the webinar is ended, we have all our registrants in the system, so it's time for us to collect the behavior data. But in order to define some of the behavior characteristics, for example, the extent of attendance for the webinar participants, we may require to have some data in the system when was the actual live part of the presentation, when it started and when it ended, something that we can't get automatically from GoToWebinar. And advanced workflow helps us to do this by using user tasks, where for the webinar moderator, which we add so that he can, in the middle of the process, when it becomes important for the next steps, he can include manually the missing data that can't be collected automatically. So in this case, the webinar moderator will be filling out the time of the presentation, where it started and when it ended for the webinar. And then, like you see, we have another logic builder action that is actual system processing the attendance data. The idea behind it, it's like pretty much the same like with getting the registrant, just the logic is different. And on this stage, we get the data on the attendees via API. And when we get the attendance time for the participants, since we have our presentation time, we can now compare it with the attendance time and define whether specific participants, so all the presentation or just part of it. And this will help us to adjust the message to personalize it for this participant. And we also get other behavior information, like which grade did this participant gave us, or if he gave us any. And if you use polls in your webinar, then you can also get the poll results. You can also then adjust the follow-up email based on these poll results. And of course, we get the webinar questions. And before we complete these webinar processes, we unfortunately we can't use the webinar questions data from GoToWebinar as it is, since it always only accounts for the questions that were answered in chat. And some of the questions we answer in voice during the end of the presentation. So we require another user task for the webinar moderator to process and mark those questions. And when it is completed, we consider that our webinar is processed. And so thus, since we already collected all the behavior data that we need for our follow-up. So let me now go into one of the leads and show you our custom webinar panel on the records that I mentioned before. So you can see here that we have when the user join time, the extent of attendance. So with this particular lead only attended part of our main presentation part during the webinar. He didn't ask us any questions, and he gave us like one of the highest rate. Now when we have all this data that we collected, we are ready to write a personalized message. But how do we create a personalized email? We need to write the text by considering all the various conditions based on factual and behavioral data that we collected about our lead. So first of all, we need to understand who we writing to. Like, is it a prospect, or maybe that's existing customer, our former customer, or our partner? Because depending on that, our message will differ. And we need to consider the level of his interest, whether he's just reaching out, or we have some communication before. And we also need to consider the behavior data that we collected during the webinar. So it's our time of attendance, it's the Q&A results, like whether he asked some questions or didn't, and whether we have already answered those questions or not. And how did he evaluate our webinar? Like, did he give us a high grade, low grade, like something in the middle, or maybe he didn't evaluate the webinar at all? All this data we need to consider while we writing our message. Plus, if the the participant is the existing customer, we also need to consider whether maybe he has some service requests filed, or maybe he has open opportunity in the work, because that will also affect the message that we are going to write. All this together gives us a large amount of condition in total, and um, the amount of total combination doesn't allow us to use the default templates to design such complicated message. But with Logic Builder, it can be easily configured using IfThen Logic to define what partial text we need to include in our message, and how to combine them all together into that final follow-up message that will be sent to our customer. So this task is solved in the context of our second process. This is the follow-up process for webinar leads. And this process is triggered when we get all that behavior data that is needed for the follow-up. And also we check whether the user has closed enrichment task, since we also use part of that factual data about the lead and about its company in our follow-up message. And as you see here, is already quite familiar logic builder actions inside our processes that we use to send the follow-up email. So let me dive into this logic builder theme to see how how this if-then logic I mentioned is designed. Okay, so here is the process. So this first part is just when we get all the parameters from the lead that we use in our email. And actually what we do then, we proceed, if you let me look at one of the parts. For example, the question, we have this part like different inserts. So this is what I was talking about those partial texts that we insert in our message. So here we have question inserts, and here we have a lot of if-then branches that, based on the results of whether the questions was asked and answered or not, or there was none questions at all, we have 3 different template inserts. And same goes to for the other conditions that we have. So for example, depending on the grade insert. We also use different templates like for the grades, like whether it's low, whether it's medium, whether it's high, or there was no grade at all. And so this summon sorts, and there are also some other parameters that in our case we use to define the base of the template. So what we have here is like we have some base template where we have depending on the attendance type and on the account type, we have 9 different base templates that we use. So each of those use different templates, and inside of them we include all the different variants of additional inserts that I just showed you before. So let me go back to the CRM and let me show you these templates. So we have them defined in the Logic Builder templates module. And as you can see here, so we have like these 9 basic emails, and we have I think 8, yeah, like 8 inserts. So if you see here, there are like question inserts, system insert, grade insert. So those are not actually the parameters, but those are inserted templates that we define by using the IfThen logic I showed you about. So this approach allows us to use about like it's less than 20 text templates to design the personalized message that will result with I think like over 100 variants of the final message. Plus, since it's multiplying because it's templates inside and templates, if we add just a few more parameters here, it will be few more templates here, and it will be increased like in 2, so it will be 200, like 400. It will be increasing exponential number of finalized personalized messages. Now, going back to our process, after we send the follow-up email, the most interesting part begins. For example, we sent our follow-up message in the email, but the reaction from the customer, since we use different channels, can come in any channel that is convenient for the customer. So after some period of time, like a week in our case, we need to conclude what has been happening with lead since we sent the follow-up email. So we check whether there was any activities, and we check for the activities across all channels. So the customer could have replied us via email, he could have made a call or scheduled a meeting. It can be so he could have like reached out indirectly, so like someone else reached out to the manager, and manager created a task on this lead. So we all consider everything that's happening, an activity. We all gather them together, all these activities in the CRM. Regardless of what it is, whether he just filled out some form of the website, or whether the manager processed some inquiry and changed the lead status. Maybe it was a personal meeting, and whatever happening, like whether there was some activities in the e-commerce or in any other way, we check all of those activities, and so these activities we collect here on the timeline that you may have seen on the let the lead load. Okay, so like on the right side of the lead we have here the timeline, and if there was like any activities on the lead, you can see that it appears here on the timeline. And as we can see in this case, so there was no activities after the webinar. So the system has processed this lead automatically. If we go back to our process, we can see here. So we check whether there were an activity. So if they were some activities, we know that we are working on this lead and we are working towards opening an opportunity. So that's all for now, and the follow-up process is finished. But if, like in the case I showed, we don't see any activities of the lead, then we need to think about keeping our quality of data. So we need to update the data in the system accordingly. So we change the stage. So we lower the priority for this lead, since we were not able to engage the lead with this webinar, and we give it back to marketing for the further nurturing. And and then in this case, yeah, the follow-up process is over as well. So that is all. So let's talk about what do we get with this solution. First, that we save a lot of time by using this seamless omnichannel interaction and allowing and collecting the data without a lot of efforts, because whatever we can, we automate. Plus, with Logic Builder, we can easily force an efficient data quality control, and to ensure that our data is of high quality. And the other thing is that with such solution that uses visual designers like Advanced Workflow and Logic Builder, you can configure and manage any omnichannel campaigns that you want, and it allows a lot of flexibility, and you can configure different conditional emails. You can configure different data exchanges, like integration, like with GoToWebinar in our case, and you can configure any data quality control logic that you require. So the complexity of the logic that you design is entirely up to you. You can do with it whatever you like, and these visual designers are really easy. Like any Sugar admin can do this, and they are also like really easy to maintain, because you can see like what's happening right there. And all you need to design for this solution is Sugar Enterprise, because we use the advanced workflow that comes with it. And advanced workflow was at the campaign choreography behind all the main processes. And then we use Logic Builder, that is used inside these processes, where we design different kinds of Sugar logic that we need to configure integration, data quality controls, and all the other logic automations that we need without programming. And of course, to keep our seamless omnichannel communication, we use a timeline viewer that can help you track all your key business events across all of your channels. So it's inside the CRM, in your marketing automation, in your ERP system, e-commerce website, whatever you need. So that is all for now, and now I'm ready for your questions. Okay, so I see that there is no questions at the time. Yeah, okay, but anyway, don't worry if you were um, can think of any questions right now, because you can rely on our help at any time. And if you think of any questions later, please write us. We are ready to help you at any time. And I hope that you enjoyed our presentation. You find what you're looking for with our presentation. So thank you everyone for the attention. Bye bye.